I never expected that a plumbing disaster in my apartment building would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It's funny how the biggest shifts can be set in motion by something as mundane as a burst pipe. Before that night, my life was a meticulously curated collection of quiet routines. It was safe, it was predictable, and it was, if I'm being honest with myself, profoundly lonely. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was 28, working as a freelance graphic designer from the small but comfortable fortress of my one-bedroom apartment. My world was largely confined to the glow of my monitor, the scent of freshly brewed coffee, and the quiet hum of the city filtering through my window. I liked it that way, or at least, I told myself I did. It was easier than admitting I was hiding. My apartment was my sanctuary. It looked out over a small, shared courtyard, and directly across the hall was apartment 3B. That was Caleb's apartment. And Caleb, well, he was a universe away from my quiet, ordered life. I first noticed him a few months after he moved in. It was impossible not to. He was a whirlwind of easy energy and casual confidence. He worked in construction or carpentry, something physical that left a light dusting of sawdust on his dark hair and filled out his frame in a way that always made my breath catch. He had a laugh that echoed in the hallway and a revolving door of friends who seemed just as loud and effortlessly charming as he was. From my window, which had a perfect view of the parking lot, I'd watch him. I'd see him coming home in his work truck, swinging a toolbox out of the back with a casual strength that seemed as natural to him as breathing. He'd greet our elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson, with a genuine warmth, often stopping to help her with her groceries without a second thought. He was kind, he was social, and he was, in my mind, a flashing billboard for everything I wasn't. He was also, I had concluded with a quiet and familiar sense of resignation, completely unattainable. The kind of guy who probably had a beautiful girlfriend, a love for sports, and a life story that didn't include a single chapter about agonizing over the hidden meaning of a shared glance in a hallway. He was a known quantity, filed away in the straight and out-of-reach cabinet in my brain. Our interactions were minimal, a collection of clipped greetings and polite nods. "Hey man," he'd say with a friendly smile if we passed each other on the stairs, and I'd offer a tight-lipped hey. In return, my heart doing a ridiculous little sprint in my chest. I analyzed every one of those two-word exchanges. Did his smile linger for a fraction of a second too long? Was that a flicker of something more in his eyes? No, of course not. It was just my own longing, painting details on a blank canvas. I built him up in my head, creating a whole persona for him based on these fleeting observations. Caleb, the charming carpenter. Caleb, the good neighbor. Caleb, the man who represented a world of easy connections and unthinking confidence that I could only watch from a distance. He was a background character in my life, a recurring bit of scenery that made my heart ache in a way that was almost comfortable in its familiarity. My days were a loop. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk, work. The hours bled into one another, distinguished only by the changing light outside my window. I had clients, I had deadlines, I had a life that was technically full, but it was a life lived behind a screen, a life of observation rather than participation. I was the narrator of my own story, but I had forgotten how to be the protagonist. And then came the Friday night that changed everything. The night the quiet, predictable rhythm of my life was shattered by a frantic knock on my door and the sound of rushing water. The night Caleb, the man from across the hall, crashed into my world in a way I could never have anticipated, bringing the chaos and the hope of his universe with him. It began with a noise, a deep, groaning sound from the building's plumbing, followed by a sudden, muffled shout from the hallway. I paused my work, pulling off my headphones. That's when I heard it clearly. Water. A lot of water, rushing and spraying with an alarming force. Curiosity and a vague sense of alarm propelled me from my chair. I opened my door a crack and peered out. The scene in the hallway was one of controlled chaos. Water was seeping from under the door of apartment 3B, pooling on the worn carpet. And there was Caleb, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand raking through his already messy hair. He was soaked, his t-shirt clinging to his chest, and his expression was a mixture of panic and disbelief. "No, I don't know where the main shutoff is. It's coming from the wall behind the sink, I think," he was saying, his voice tight with stress. He saw me peeking out, and his eyes, wide and desperate, met mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The carefully constructed distance between our two worlds, the mere 12 feet of hallway carpet, vanished in an instant. He wasn't the confident, charming neighbor anymore. He was just a guy whose apartment was currently attempting to become an indoor swimming pool. The building manager, a gruff man named Sal, eventually arrived and, after a great deal of cursing and clanking, managed to shut off the water. But the damage was done. Sal delivered the verdict with a grim finality. A main pipe had burst inside the wall. Caleb's kitchen was flooded, the drywall was compromised, and the apartment would be unlivable for at least a week, probably more. I stood in my doorway, a silent observer to the whole drama. I watched as Caleb slumped against the wall, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving him looking utterly defeated. He ran a hand over his face, smearing a bit of grime on his cheek. He looked so lost. He started muttering to himself, probably running through a list of friends he could call, couches he could crash on. And in that moment, a voice in my head, a brave and reckless stranger that sounded nothing like me, spoke up. It was a simple, insane impulse, an act of kindness that felt more like leaping off a cliff. Before I could second-guess it, before my usual caution could clamp down on the thought, I pulled my door open wider. "You can stay with me," I said. The words hung in the damp air between us. Caleb's head snapped up. He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard me correctly. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. What had I just done? I had just invited the whirlwind into my sanctuary. "What?" he asked, his voice quiet. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Too late to back out now. I have a spare room," I elaborated, trying to sound casual, as if this were a perfectly normal thing for me to offer. "It's not much, but it has a bed. You could stay here until they get your place sorted out." A series of emotions flickered across his face: surprise, suspicion, and then a wave of profound relief that seemed to soften every tense line in his body. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You do that?" "Yeah, of course," I said, the lie of my casualness feeling paper thin. "It's no problem at all. We're neighbors, right?" He let out a long, shaky breath, a sound that was half laugh, half sigh of exhaustion. "Man, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Seriously. You're a lifesaver." He pushed himself off the wall and took a step towards my open door, a small, grateful smile finally reaching his eyes. And just like that, the barrier was breached. Caleb crossed the threshold, bringing with him the scent of rain-soaked clothes, sawdust, and impending chaos. My quiet, predictable life was officially over. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in awkwardness. We were two strangers suddenly navigating the intimate geography of a small apartment. I felt like I was hosting a foreign dignitary, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. I tried to act normal, but my version of normal involved solitude and silence, which wasn't exactly conducive to being a good host. Caleb, to his credit, seemed to sense my apprehension. He was quiet and incredibly considerate, taking up as little space as possible. He moved with a surprising grace for a man his size, his footsteps soft on my hardwood floors. He insisted on sleeping on the couch the first night, claiming the spare room was too much of an imposition, and I had to practically argue with him to get him to take the actual bed. We fell into a tentative routine. I'd wake up early, make coffee in silence, and retreat to my office. He would emerge later, shower, and head out to deal with insurance adjusters and contractors, leaving the apartment blessedly empty for a few hours. In the evenings, we'd coexist in the living room, me with my laptop, him with his phone, the space between us filled with the sound of a television show neither of us was really watching. It was during these quiet evenings that the image I had of him began to fracture and reshape itself into something far more complex and interesting. The loud, boisterous guy from the hallway was replaced by this person who was thoughtful and, at times, surprisingly reserved. He wasn't the one-dimensional character I had created. He was a real person, and the reality of him was far more captivating. One night, about 3 days into his stay, I was working late on a particularly frustrating logo design. I was staring at the screen, moving pixels around with a sense of growing despair, when I heard him clear his throat behind me. "Everything all right?" he asked. I jumped, startled. I hadn't even realized he was in the room. Oh yeah? Fine. Just work? I mumbled, gesturing vaguely at the monitor. He came closer, peering over my shoulder. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint scent of the soap he'd used. My focus completely shattered. What is it? He asked, his voice genuinely curious. It's a logo for a new artisanal bakery, I explained, my voice sounding thin. They want something that feels rustic but modern, which is apparently code for impossible to design. He let out a soft chuckle. He pointed at a detail on the screen. You know, if you soften the serif on that font, it might balance out the icon a little better. Give it a more organic feel. I stared at him, completely taken aback. It was actually a good suggestion. A really good suggestion. How did you know that? I asked, my surprise evident. A faint blush crept up his neck. He shrugged, suddenly looking a little shy. I don't know. I used to draw a lot. Back in high school, I wanted to be an architect. This was a side of Caleb I could never have imagined. The carpenter who swung heavy toolboxes had a past filled with sketchbooks and font serifs. Really? What happened? I asked, turning in my chair to face him properly. Life, you know, he said with a wry smile. My dad owns his own construction company. It was just expected that I'd join him. It was the practical choice. He paused, a flicker of something, regret, maybe, in his eyes. But I still doodle sometimes. He pulled out his phone and, after a moment of hesitation, started scrolling through his photos. He showed me pictures of sketches he'd made. They weren't doodles. They were beautiful, intricate drawings of buildings, furniture, and delicate, impossible structures. They were filled with a sensitivity and an attention to detail that seemed so at odds with the loud, easygoing persona I had assigned to him. I was looking at a hidden part of him, a vulnerable secret he had just chosen to share with me. It felt significant. It felt like a bridge being built across the space that had separated us. In that moment, he wasn't just the hot guy from across the hall. He was Caleb, a man with buried dreams and a quiet, artistic soul. And the hope that I had tried so hard to suppress began to stir, growing bolder and more insistent. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen to find 2 mugs on the counter. One of them was mine, filled with coffee, prepared exactly how I liked it, black, with half a teaspoon of sugar. I had only mentioned it once, in passing, on that first chaotic night. He had remembered. He was standing by the window, looking out at the courtyard, and he turned when he heard me enter. Morning, he said, his smile soft. Figured you could use this. I picked up the mug, the warmth seeping into my cold hands. It was such a small thing, just a cup of coffee, but it felt like so much more. It was a gesture of care, of attentiveness. It was a sign that he was paying attention to me, the real me, not just the guy whose apartment he was crashing in. Thank you, I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. This is really thoughtful. It's the least I can do, he replied. But his eyes held mine for a beat too long, a silent communication passing between us that I didn't have the courage to name. A dangerous, thrilling warmth spread through my chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the coffee. It was hope, pure and terrifying, and I realized, with a jolt, that I was no longer just observing my life. I was starting to live it. By the end of the first week, a comfortable rhythm had settled over the apartment. The initial awkwardness had melted away, replaced by a sort of quiet domesticity that felt both thrilling and terrifyingly natural. We started eating dinner together, not out of obligation, but because we both seemed to want to. Our conversations flowed easily now, moving from his frustrations with the slow-moving insurance company to my struggles with a difficult client. We were learning the shapes and patterns of each other's lives. I learned that Caleb hated cilantro, that he could name almost any tree by its leaf, and that he had a younger sister he was fiercely protective of. He learned that I organized my books by color, that I had an encyclopedic knowledge of bad 80s horror movies, and that I hummed, completely unconsciously, when I was concentrating on a design. We were sharing the small, seemingly insignificant details that, when woven together, create the tapestry of a person. The turning point came on a Saturday night. A storm had rolled in, a dramatic, thundering affair that rattled the windows and cut the power to our entire block. One moment we were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless action movie, and the next we were plunged into sudden, absolute darkness. Well, that's great, Caleb said into the blackness, his voice startlingly close. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the dark, illuminating his face. He was smiling, a look of amused resignation in his eyes. "I have candles," I offered, my voice a little shaky. The sudden intimacy of the situation, just the two of us trapped in the dark, had my nerves on high alert. We lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The apartment, which had felt so familiar, was suddenly transformed into a new and mysterious space. The television was silent, the hum of the refrigerator was gone. All that was left was the sound of the rain lashing against the windows and our own breathing. We sat back on the couch, not as far apart as we usually did. The darkness seemed to have dissolved some invisible barrier between us. "So," Caleb said, his voice softer now. "No movie. What do we do?" We talked. Not about work or insurance or any of the other safe topics we'd been circling. We really talked. He told me about growing up in a small town, about the immense pressure he felt to live up to his father's expectations. He spoke of his dream, not of being an architect anymore, but of designing and building his own furniture. He described the feel of different woods, the beauty of a perfect dovetail joint, with a passion that was mesmerizing. I found myself opening up in return. I told him about why I chose to work from home, about the social anxiety that had followed me since I was a kid. I talked about how my work was both a refuge and a prison, a way to connect with the world without ever having to truly be in it. It was more than I had told anyone in years. He just listened, his gaze steady and patient in the candlelight, making me feel seen in a way that was both unnerving and deeply comforting. As I was talking, my hand was resting on the cushion between us. The conversation lulled, and in the comfortable silence, surrounded by the storm outside and the candlelight within, I felt his hand brush against mine. It was a light, almost accidental touch. My entire body went rigid. I was sure he would pull away, maybe with an awkward laugh. But he didn't. Instead, his fingers moved with an impossible, breathtaking slowness. He gently, tentatively, laced his fingers with mine. My heart stopped. Or maybe it started beating for the first time. I couldn't be sure. We just sat there in the flickering darkness, our hands clasped together, the warmth of his skin a startling, electric shock against mine. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The air was thick with everything we weren't saying. It was a question being asked and answered all at once. My mind was racing, trying to catch up with what my body already knew. This wasn't friendship. This wasn't neighborly kindness. This was something else entirely. I could feel the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip, but there was a tremor in his hand that betrayed his own nervousness. He was as scared as I was. That realization was a thunderclap of its own, louder than the storm outside. The confident, unattainable man I had watched from my window was sitting here in the dark, his hand trembling slightly in mine. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, the world reduced to the sound of the rain and the feeling of his hand holding mine. It was the most intimate, most charged moment of my life. And in the quiet darkness of my apartment, a new and terrifying hope was born, brighter and more powerful than any flickering candle flame. The lights flickered once, twice, and then flooded the room with a harsh, unforgiving brightness. The spell was shattered. We flinched, blinking against the sudden glare. At the same moment, as if by some unspoken, panicked agreement, we pulled our hands apart. The loss of contact was immediate and jarring, a sudden coldness where there had been warmth. Caleb wouldn't look at me. He stared at the now blaring television, his jaw tight. The easy intimacy of the darkness was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating awkwardness. The air, which moments before had been electric with unspoken possibilities, was now heavy with regret and confusion. Or at least, that's what I projected onto it. "Well," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the newly restored quiet of the apartment. He cleared his throat and pushed himself up from the couch. "Guess I should, head to bed. It's late." "Yeah," I managed to choke out, my eyes fixed on a random spot on the rug. "Good idea." He hesitated for a second by the hallway, as if he wanted to say something more. But he just muttered a quick, "Night, Lucas," and disappeared into the spare room, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the silence like a gunshot. I sat there on the couch for a long time, my hand still tingling from his touch. My mind was a chaotic storm of its own, replaying the moment over and over again. The tentative brush of his fingers, the gentle way he had woven his hand into mine, the tremor I had felt in his grip. Had I imagined it? Had I misinterpreted a simple gesture of comfort in a weird situation? The next day, Sunday, was agonizing. A heavy, unspoken tension hung between us, a third resident in the small apartment. We moved around each other with a new, painful carefulness, like two dancers who had forgotten the steps to a familiar routine. Our conversations were stilted, confined to safe, impersonal topics. Do we need more milk? Did you see the weather forecast? The easy camaraderie we had built over the past week had evaporated. He spent most of the day on the phone in the spare room, talking to contractors. I hid in my office, pretending to work, but all I could do was stare at a blank screen. My internal monologue was a relentless loop of self-doubt and recrimination. Of course, he was straight. He was just being nice, offering a moment of human connection during a power outage. I was the one who had layered it with meaning, who had projected my own desperate hopes onto him. I was an idiot. I had taken his kindness and twisted it into something it wasn't. And now I had made things unbearably weird. He was probably counting the seconds until his apartment was fixed so he could escape the quiet, intense guy across the hall who clearly couldn't take a hint. The fear of rejection was a cold, heavy knot in my stomach. It was so much worse than the quiet loneliness I had felt before. This was an active, aching pain. I was so wrapped up in my own spiraling thoughts that I almost convinced myself the whole thing was a figment of my imagination, a dream I'd had in the dark. But then I would remember the feeling of his calloused hand in mine, the undeniable reality of it. It had happened. It was real. But what did it mean? Every time he came into the same room as me, my heart would start to pound. I tried to read his expression, searching for some clue, some sign of what he was thinking. But his face was a mask of polite neutrality. He avoided my eyes. And that, more than anything, felt like a confirmation of my worst fears. He regretted it. He was embarrassed. That evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to fix this, to put the genie back in the bottle. I would apologize, make some self-deprecating joke about the weirdness of the blackout, and assure him I hadn't read anything into it. I would release him from whatever awkward obligation he felt. It would hurt, but it would be better than this crushing silence. I just had to work up the courage to do it. I was standing in the kitchen, pretending to be absorbed in making a simple pasta dinner, when he finally emerged from the spare room. My plan to act casual and confident dissolved the moment I heard his footsteps. My hands trembled slightly as I stirred the sauce. This was it, the moment of truth, and I was terrified of what the truth would be. He didn't say anything at first. He just leaned against the doorframe, watching me. The silence stretched, filled with the bubbling of the sauce and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I could feel his eyes on me, and I kept my back to him, focusing on the mundane task of stirring. If I didn't look at him, maybe this wouldn't be real. "Lucas," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the silence. "Can we talk about last night?" My stomach plummeted. I closed my eyes for a brief second, bracing myself. Here it comes. The "let's just be friends" speech. The "I'm not gay, but I was just feeling weird" explanation. I slowly turned off the stove and turned to face him, my expression carefully neutral, preparing for the gentle, painful rejection I was sure was coming. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He pushed himself off the doorframe and took a few steps into the kitchen, stopping a few feet away from me. He looked nervous, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He wasn't looking at me, but at a point on the floor just past my shoulder. "Look," he started, then stopped, letting out a frustrated breath. "I'm sorry if I made things weird." After the lights came back on. And all day today. This was not the opening I expected. "It's fine," I lied, my voice tight. "Don't worry about it." "No, it's not fine," he insisted, finally lifting his head and meeting my gaze. His eyes were filled with a raw, uncertain vulnerability that took my breath away. I acted like a jerk. I freaked out, I guess. I didn't know what to say to that. I just stood there, my hands gripping the edge of the counter behind me. He took another step closer. "What happened last night, when we were holding hands, that wasn't an accident, Lucas. And it wasn't just the blackout making things weird." He said the words as if he were reading my mind. "I wanted to do that. I've wanted to for a while, actually. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The narrative I had so carefully constructed in my head, the one where I was the delusional one and he was the kind, straight neighbor, was crumbling around me. "What?" I whispered, the sound barely audible. A wry, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "This is going to sound crazy," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But I've noticed you since I moved in. I'd see you at your window when I was coming home, and I always thought you looked so focused, so calm." He chuckled softly. "I might have engineered a few accidental run-ins in the hallway, hoping you'd say more than just hey." He was confessing. He was admitting to the very things I had told myself were just my own hopeful fantasies. My mind was reeling, trying to process his words. "When my apartment flooded," he continued, his voice earnest and low, "the first person I thought of was you. And when you offered me a place to stay, it felt like, I don't know, like a sign, maybe. And getting to know you this past week, seeing the real you, it's only made everything I was feeling stronger." He looked down at his feet, then back up at me, his expression resolute. "I think I've been pretending for a long time, Lucas. To my family, my friends, myself. And I think I'm done pretending." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. All the anxiety, all the fear, all the desperate hope I had been carrying around seemed to release at once. I started, my voice breaking. "I thought I was imagining it all. I thought you were just being nice." "Nice?" He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Lucas, I've been staring at you across crowded rooms I wasn't even in. The only thing I haven't been is honest." He closed the remaining distance between us. He was so close now I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. He gently reached out, not for my hand this time, but to cup my cheek, his thumb stroking softly against my skin. The gesture was so tender, so full of unspoken emotion, that a single tear escaped and traced a path down my face. "So," he whispered, his gaze searching mine, "am I crazy? Or are you feeling this too?" "You're not crazy," I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. I leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. "I've been feeling this since the day you moved in." A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of pure relief and joy. And then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't like the movies. It was hesitant and a little clumsy at first, a question asked in the dark. But as I responded, as I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled him closer, it deepened into something confident and sure. It tasted of salt and hope and the promise of a new beginning. In the warmth of my small kitchen, with the scent of forgotten pasta sauce in the air, I wasn't just the observer anymore. I was finally, breathtakingly, part of the story. The weeks that followed the confession were like waking up from a long, gray dream into a world of startling color. The crushing tension was gone, replaced by an easy, joyful intimacy. Caleb's apartment was eventually repaired, the drywall replaced, and the floors refinished, but he never really moved back in. His toolbox migrated to my front closet, his toothbrush found a permanent home in my bathroom, and his laughter became the new, welcome soundtrack of my apartment. We fell into the comfortable rhythms of a couple. We went on actual dates, to a small Italian restaurant he loved, to a late-night showing of a terrible horror movie I picked, to a quiet spot by the river where we just sat and talked for hours. We learned each other's histories, our fears, our ridiculous, hidden quirks. I discovered he was a terrible singer, but an amazing cook. He learned that I was fiercely competitive at board games, a fact he found endlessly amusing. There was a beautiful simplicity to it all. Waking up next to him, the morning light filtering through the blinds. The casual touch of his hand on the small of my back as we passed each other in the kitchen. Watching him sketch at the dining room table, completely absorbed in bringing a piece of furniture to life on paper, and feeling a sense of peace so profound it almost hurt. One Saturday, a couple of months later, we were carrying a new bookshelf he had built into my office. It was made of a dark, rich walnut, and the craftsmanship was stunning. It was the first piece of his own design he had ever completed. As we maneuvered it into place, he paused and looked around the room, then at me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he said, "I hated this apartment for months. My apartment, I mean. It always felt temporary, just a place to sleep. But your place, from the first night I stayed here, it felt like a home." I smiled, my heart swelling. "It didn't feel like a home until you were in it," I admitted, and it was the truest thing I had ever said. We were no longer just Lucas from 3A and Caleb from 3B. We were just Lucas and Caleb. The arbitrary boundaries of hallways and doorways had dissolved, leaving behind a connection that felt solid and real. The man I had once thought of as an entirely different species, a resident of another universe, was now the most familiar and essential part of mine. Sometimes I think about that burst pipe, that random, inconvenient disaster. It felt like the end of the world for him at the time, and a source of quiet panic for me. But it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. It was the universe creating a crack in the walls we had built around ourselves, letting the light, and each other, in. Life has a funny way of surprising you. You can build a safe, quiet fortress and convince yourself you're content, that the view from the window is enough. But you never truly know what you're missing until someone knocks on your door in the middle of a crisis, dripping water on your carpet and offering you a glimpse of a world you were too afraid to even wish for. And you learn that the greatest risk isn't opening the door, it's never opening it at all.